Hey, everybody. You are watching School Psych Podcast. Very excited tonight for our guest. This is also the first episode that we've had since being back at NASP. So we were all going to share a little bit about our experience at NASP, which was totally fun. Let's see. I collected 55 pens. For next year, I know there's some room for improvement, and I'm going to set a goal. Somebody suggested 65, so I might try for that. Rebecca won the Rookie of the Year award at NASP, which was super exciting. So we're all very enthused and over the moon for that. So congratulations, Rebecca, Rookie of the Year. And I saw some really great presentations, and I was sure to stalk everybody who's been on the podcast so I could touch base with them. And really, really great stuff. I think two of my favorite are probably Dr. Farmer did a functional analysis one, which was super informative. So he doesn't know it yet, but I'm going to be bothering him to come on the podcast to talk about functional analysis. There was a great one from a whole bunch of past podcast guests with Dr. Burns and Dr. McGill and Dr. Bojan, and that was on LD, and that was amazing. There was some really great stuff. It was also fun to meet everybody and people coming up to us and saying hi, so that was fun. And just meeting all these psych superstars and all our psych heroes. So that was really good. Going to follow up, though, too, with some bad news. Some of you have noticed that the Google Drive is down. I guess we got reported for copyright issues. So no. So I'm trying to talk with Google and trying to get it back. But it's like the Drive is like my third child, probably. So I'm very upset about this. And so I'm just venting a little bit right now. So happy thoughts for the Google Drive, because I know that everybody pulls resources from that and seems to enjoy it. I know I like using it a lot. But anyways, that's my little rant. But I am Rachel, and I'm a school psychologist from Maryland, and I'm going to pass it over to Rebecca. Rebecca?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca. I'm a school psychologist in Connecticut. And if you're watching us live, first of all, happy St. Patrick's Day. Thank you for being here. It's a really great episode, so I'm glad that you put down your green beverages to join us. Or if you didn't, that's okay too. So if you're watching us, you can participate by signing right into your Google YouTube account. Once you're signed in, there'll be a chat box right next to the video, and I will be looking for questions, comments, thoughts there. You can also comment on either of the Facebook pages, School Psych, Your School Psychologist, or the School Psych podcast page. You can send me a message. You can post right to the page. I'll be looking for notifications, and also on Twitter using the hashtag PsychPodcast. And as I learned at NASP, many of you listen to us later on iTunes or watch the recording. And I think that's great. Also, we don't want to not have you join in the conversation. So if you're listening to us but not live and you have a thought or a question, please find us on Facebook or Twitter or on YouTube and tell us what you think, because we're really looking forward to making this a collaborative conversation always. So we really appreciate your thoughts. And I just want to also share a little bit about my very first national conference at NASP. It was awesome. It was slightly overwhelming because there are so many fantastic presentations, and they either start at the same time or overlap, and the hotel was ginormous. So I got in my steps, and even though I unpacked my running shoes that I brought, I definitely got my workout just getting back and forth. So it was such a great experience. I learned so much. I left feeling really inspired. So I hope to see more of you next year in Baltimore. I definitely want to make it a priority to get there. I know it's a hard time of year and all of that, but it's so worth it. If you're out there thinking about it, come to Baltimore next year. And now here is Eric to introduce himself and our wonderful guest.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Eric, also a school psychologist in Connecticut. And I'm excited to have our guest here this evening, Dr. Amanda VanderHeyden. And I will say a couple of things. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about NASP before I introduce her, but it was exciting to see her and see her present at NASP and get a chance to talk with her in person, and a number of other colleagues that we all read and admire. So it was exciting to be there. It was exciting to be there with the podcast with Rachel and Rebecca. as well as our communications committee. So I think sometimes when you go to these big events, you'll meet people and you'll make friends, but it's also nice to go there with people you know, with your teammates, with your colleagues, because you can divide and conquer and then share information, or at least collaborate and talk about what you've learned. And really my theme for what I wanted to focus on was evidence-based interventions, which is very important and part of what we're going to talk about tonight. So I first came across Dr. VanderHeyden's name from this book, so I'll give a little plug. This is absolutely one of my favorite books on RTI, and this is the RTI approach to evaluating learning disabilities that she co-wrote with Dr. Shapiro and Kowaleski. And she can tell us a little bit about book 2, which is coming out as well. But Dr. VanderHeyden has a wonderfully distinguished career in working toward evidence-based interventions and scientific research, curriculum, all kinds of things. So I'm going to read a little bit about her and introduce her. So Dr. VanderHeyden, Ph.D., is currently a private consultant and researcher. She has worked for several universities and as well as a national trainer in a number of school districts, and has published over 85 articles and 7 books and a number of chapters related to RTI and evidence-based intervention. In 2006, she was named to a National Center for Learning Disabilities advisory panel to provide guidance related to RTI. She has served on editorial boards of several journals, including School Psych Quarterly and the Journal of Early Intervention. She's the author of Essentials of Response to Intervention, co-authored with Dr. Matthew Burns, keeping RTI on track, how to identify, repair, and prevent mistakes that derail implementation, with Dr. David Tilley, and is co-editor of the Handbook of Response to Intervention as well. She received the 2006 Lightner Witmer Early Career Contributions Award from the APA for her scholarship on early intervention, RTI, and models of database decision-making. She has served as researcher and advisor to iSTEEP, a web-based data management system, and has served on the faculties of LSU and UC Santa Barbara. She is currently a consultant with her business, Spring Math, which brings together her skills in effective systems improvement, high-yield intervention delivery, managing systems change in schools in order to help teachers help children develop better math success. In 2018, she wrote an article for the Communique that was entitled, "Why Do School Psychs Cling to Ineffective Practices? Let's Do What Works." And I found that article to be incredibly valuable. So welcome, Dr. VanderHeyden. And maybe we should start with, what are some of these practices that we cling to that are ineffective?
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure.
Well, you know, as I said in the article, I think it's the rare school psychologists who can swim against the stream of ineffective practices that are demanded of them probably on a daily basis, right? So probably most school psychs can identify right away with being in the gatekeeper role, with this vision on the part of teachers and families that just getting that SLD label is going to improve the life of the student. We all know that first of all, the empirical data do not support that, but we've all lived that. That is a horrible miscarriage, really, of justice for families who are looking for help. So many times school psychs choose the path of least resistance and say, yep, let's just do an evaluation, give an eligibility, but it doesn't really produce benefit for the child. That's probably the biggest one.
That makes sense. One of the things I think, as I read more about evidence-based interventions and skill by treatment interaction, is really 2 facts, I guess. One is that we are not always experiencing appreciable differences with special education support. And the other is, just as you said, there's that myth that we get into special ed and that solves the problem. But maybe getting back to the foundations of instruction and educational beneficence, I guess, as opposed to malfeasance. So in terms of addressing some of that, what are some suggestions you have for sort of helping us break some of these cycles.
Yeah, we all have to just make a commitment to do what works, right? It's really that simple. I mean, it is a matter of saying, I choose as a professional to engage in tactics and actions that have a shot of working if they get implemented well. And I'm going to make sure they get implemented well. That's where most interventions fall apart, right? And try to resist the tide that is taking me in the direction of just going along, right? Just going along because it's what the teacher wants, or just going along because it's what the parent has asked for. We have a bigger responsibility. Our client is the child, and we need to demonstrate benefit to the student. There's such great pieces that have been written about this, and one of my favorites is one that Doug Carnine wrote. And he said in this piece that if you want to have a sustainable profession over time, then you must demonstrate that your profession can bring benefit to your client. I mean, it's really that simple. And there are tactics that will do that, and there are tactics that won't. And we know what they are. There's no mystery to it. And I think about the great early research studies conducted by Jim Eiseldike and the Center for Learning Disabilities a million years ago that demonstrated that, in fact, kids with so-called learning disabilities do not actually learn differently. They do not respond to tactics that we don't know about in some kind of differentially superior way. And if you have been told that, if you have learned that, you have been told something that is a falsehood, and you need to dig into that, because tactics that really don't require any kind of psychoeducational batteries of assessment give you a high yield for their use. They're cheap to use because you don't have to know very much before you use them in terms of the child, the assessment of the child. And they include things like increasing dosage of corrective feedback, right? Providing clearer models of correct responding, teaching children behavior expectations in a way that is explicit and direct, rewarding correct use of classroom rules. I mean, they're very simple tactics, and they work. I mean, this is part of what, in my early years, I wanted to study interventions, and I wanted to really study tier 3 interventions, and I never really got there because the simple tactics have been so effective. And what I learned is that the simple tactics are very clear. We've known about them for 30 or 40 years, but getting them consistently implemented is ubiquitous. It is a pernicious, difficult mountain to climb. And that's where we need to, that's the future of school psychology in my mind, is the use of implementation science to make better decisions and take actions, even when everything is aligned against your taking that action.
I love everything that you just said.
Me too.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's tough. You know, I was telling you guys, there's a podcast in emergency medicine that I just love to listen to over the years. And I remember hearing this guy, I think his name is Greg Henry, and he's an attorney and a physician. I think he was the one who told this story, but he's a practicing ER doctor. And he says, he's telling the story about, he's taking care of this child, and the dad is an attorney who sues for malpractice, right? And they are demanding this very particular medical treatment that, by the way, has side effects. And he is saying, you know, everything in this environment is aligned with me just giving you what you want. Every contingency I can encounter is telling me, just do this thing that I know is not good for this kid, except for one, which is my responsibility is to do what's best for this kid. So I have to stand up against you, and I have to say, no, I'm not going to do this unnecessary CAT scan because of a risk of radiation exposure that is not justified in this case, and this is why. We have to be braver and bolder about being willing to do that in school psychology and hold ourselves accountable to doing those things that will work for students.
When I saw you at NASP, you know, I tweeted out a quote that you said, something along the lines of ineffective practices are not benign, you know, because I think that lots of times people are like, well, it won't hurt, like it's not hurt, but we're taking kids, when we're doing these ineffective practices, we're taking kids away from, you know, time is valuable. Yes. And so, yeah.
We distract it. If nothing else, we dilute the treatment, don't we? Mm-hmm. Because if you give a teacher 7 actions to take and you're not very clear about these are the 2 that really count, then the teacher, chances are, is not going to implement those 2. You know? And maybe the other 5, if they don't move the dial, we shouldn't be recommending them. That's my position.
Yeah, I also reshared a tweet that that I recently noticed that you shared about how also using ineffective practice is unethical because of the amount of time and energy and taxpayer dollars that are spent in the wrong direction. I think that's really important. But how would you, so, and as you're talking and as I read your article, I had this vision of school psychologist almost like an organizational psychologist, right? Like almost like in that consultant role, this model of identify the need, you know, the student, the child is our client, but yet we're looking at the organization as a whole and how it's supporting the child.
Yes.
So where do we start in that picture?
Yeah,
Different.
That's how I love to practice, right? Because that's what's cool about what we do, by the way. I mean, we operate in the coolest environment on the planet when you care about learning outcomes and behavior outcomes for children. Because first of all, you have access to the child all day in the environment in which they must function. And you have influence or opportunity to have influence over those adults who are working directly with that child every single day. And that's really cool. I mean, if you're sitting in an office as a clinical psychologist, then you might see them for an hour a week, make some recommendations, they go away. Guess what? They don't do it. We know that. That's what the data say. So we have an opportunity to actually move the dial for kids because we have so much more access and so much more really control, for lack of a better word, over the variables that count for the student. And I have to just, say, as I always do, Ed Shapiro was a great influence on me. He was not my major professor, just a dear, dear friend and a big supporter of, for me and my own work, but he influenced me with his writing. And one of the articles that he wrote that I especially loved was about solving big problems, not little problems, right? And that was Ed's approach. And Ed, of course, described that in a paper that changed my life that I read in graduate school by Linton Shapiro in 1986. And the article was really all about how do you look at the environment in which we expect the child to function? How do you measure the ability of the child to function in that environment? And then how do you begin to adjust the things in the environment that you have control over so that you can get a better result? And of course, that was the birth of RTI. It just wasn't called RTI yet, but they were beginning to define that concept in 1986. And I remember Joe Witt saying to me shortly after, he was my mentor, was my mentor in graduate school. And he said to me, I have this idea, Amanda, that maybe we could do a functional analysis of the academic environment. And that led to the development, of course, of the can't do, won't do assessment, which, by the way, was named by a principal. It was the only good idea that principal ever had. He was not the most effective principal to work with, but he did suggest that name, and it was a cool name for that very simple assessment that we could do to figure out, does a child really need contingencies, or does the child's behavior really need skill-based training? And I'm talking about with academic behavior, right? So that was really work that came out of the early, very behavioral school psychologists. And now we have RTI, and RTI is about organizational behavior change. And so you have to be prepared to think about, well, how is the system functioning? And what are the contingencies that affect the system? And then how do we bring contingencies that benefit the child into alignment with the contingencies that benefit the system? And that's often easy to do. It got much easier to do in 2001 when schools really were forced to care about academic learning gains for all students. That, pre-2001, it just wasn't that way. You could sort of say, well, teaching is an art. And, well, how do we know? Let's argue about the outcome measures. And then after 2001, everything changed. That's my favorite chapter in the book with Joe Kovaleski, and he wrote it, is the first chapter. And he really masterfully retells, having lived it, how all of these mutually referential legislative pieces came together that really were about, if you will, consequential validity. Is what we are doing making a difference? We must demonstrate that we are making a difference and having benefit for students. So I feel really lucky because I kind of grew up in this context of this new world of school psychology, which does, take you away from working one-on-one with one student and admiring the problem and studying the problem and characterizing the problem. And oh my gosh, I hate this term, triangulating the data around a problem. That's not necessary, by the way. If you use a reliable measure, you don't need 3 measures. Makes me crazy, but I do think, what's next for us? Well, what's next for us is to really think about yield and think about operating in ways that are more efficient. One of the things that I've been doing over the last several years is building software to support RTI implementation for math. And really, that's about improving math performance system-wide. And I tell you, if you build software, people will misuse it. And when they do, it's a lesson. I mean, it's feedback to us about this is what they need. This is what we gave them, but this is what they need. And one of the things that we have seen is it's a little alarming to me. It opens my eyes, but even when we are providing the correct intensive individualized intervention, they're really not happening with great frequency in schools. So, and we know that because we can collect the data behind the scenes. So we see that class-wide math intervention is widely used in our system. So with about 20,000 users, 90% or better are exposed to class-wide intervention. Well, that really comes down to one explanation. It's more efficient. It's higher yield. And that is the feedback that we get from systems. So now we sort of know one-on-one individualized intervention is unlikely to happen. And even in the past, when we assume it's happening, and we're collecting progress monitoring data points every week, it may not be happening. It may not be happening. So the future, I think, for RTI implementation is going to be one that has to focus on the question of efficiency.
We have a viewer question that might make us hop one step backward for a second, because, but I think it's a good question. She's asking if you could explain a little bit more about why students with learning disabilities don't learn differently or differentially, I should say, maybe.
Yeah, if I could pull up because I just saw Jim Eiseldike, of course, at NASP, and if you've not read his work, you should be reading his work. It is still relevant. It's maybe more relevant than ever. And I just was mentioning to Dr. Eiseldike, Jim, that 50% of the references in my dissertation come from his work. And he ran these really beautiful studies with Algazine and, I hope I don't forget anybody, Christensen, Martha Thurlow, and they were investigating just these basic assumptions that everybody had at the time, which were, well, instruction must look different in the special education classroom for kids who carry a label of learning disability. And so they studied it. And they quantified what does instruction look like, and they found, well, it really doesn't look very different. And then they looked at, well, what type of instruction produces an effect on learning for kids we call LD and kids who struggle but we don't call LD, and there's no difference. So certain tactics like instructional learning trials or opportunities to respond, embedding lots of those produces a known and powerful effect on learning. Using formative assessment and actually using it, meaning you interpret the data and then you do something differently as a result, produces a known and very powerful effect on learning. Things like Matt Burns has published a lot about skill by treatment interactions, it's not really his idea. He just gave it such a catchy name. But that idea has existed for a long time. And he would say that too. It comes from the instructional hierarchy work. And what those folks early on, Herring and White, found that if you can look at a child's proficiency and measure that, then you can characterize the readiness of the learner for certain types of instructional tactics. And so if a child is at the acquisition stage of learning, they are accurate, but they're going to be very slow. It's going to be halting responses on their part. They may be unsure. They can be accurate. They can even be, 90% accurate, but they are at the acquisition stage of learning. And then once they become really accurate, so maybe closer to 100%, Then they enter what is called the instructional or independent stage of learning. And when that happens, the tactics that were appropriate for acquisition instruction no longer serve the child. And this is what the skill by treatment interaction will show you, is that when the child gets the tactic that is aligned with their level of proficiency, their rate of learning goes up. It's a beautiful thing to watch. I mean, we can watch it in large data sets. You could watch it one-on-one with a child just for fun if you like to geek out on that kind of stuff. But it's really replicable. It's very solid. And if you want to know more about that, I'd be happy to send you a slide and show you. Actually, I could probably pull one up, and then I'd be happy to send it to you if you'd like to look at it. When I was at NASP last week or 2 weeks ago, I do remember saying that this was the slide to copy. This was the one to look at. Let me see if I can blow that up a little bit. But here it is. So if a child is at the acquisition stage of learning, these are the evidence-based tactics that will produce the greatest amount of learning or the greatest benefit for the student. If the child is accurate but slow, then they enter a phase called the independent stage of learning, which we use fluency building intervention at that stage, and they will benefit from these particular tactics. And what happens is, if you have a child who's ready for fluency building instruction and you're still using these kinds of tactics like providing cues, which, by the way, can make a child cue dependent. It's a big problem for children with autism many times. Or you're providing prompting that they don't need, or you're providing corrective feedback, so you're interrupting them to tell them they got it correct, then what you're actually doing is you're costing the tactics here that work. For example, when a child is in the independent stage of learning is ready for fluency building instruction, the name of the game is opportunities to respond. And opportunities to respond are simply what they sound like. The child is given a cue, like a problem, that they have an opportunity to respond, and then they get some type of feedback if they need it. And that's a complete learning trial or an opportunity to respond. Charlie Greenwood was one of the first to write about that in the 1980s. Great, great work. But anyway, if you are interrupting a child to tell a child that they got it right or to give them prompts that they don't need, then you're really stealing opportunities to respond. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Think about it that way. So then it's misaligned, and what will happen is, if you're using these tactics when a child is in the fluency building range of learning, then performance goes down. And that's what the skill by treatment interaction shows. And of course, I love the Burns, Cotting, Lucido. I might have one more author, 2010. It's just a great paper demonstrating in a meta-analysis exactly that effect.
That's great. I'm wondering if we can post that slide when you send it, maybe on the Facebook page, or
if only we had a Google Drive.
If only.
Sorry.
Rubbing salt in the wounds, Eric.
I'm sorry.
Maybe someone wants to fund our Dropbox account.
Yeah.
Some really independently wealthy school psychologists out there.
Only $99 for an annual account, right?
Yeah. We need maybe school psyched pens. We need to do the psyched pen project to raise funds. So
I like it.
Put it all together.
Super awesome. And I do remember that slide from your presentation. I remember people taking pictures of it and everything. It kind of reminds me too that the original question of, kids with LD, not learning differently from other kids. But we know we have a friend online, Dr. Barnes, who is, frequent on some of the forums and stuff online. And he's posted before that he kind of rationalizes things by reminding himself that LD is more a legal animal than a clinical animal in many respects, because we have whatever arbitrary, definitions and restrictions on who gets special ed versus who doesn't, and it's more legalities than anything real and tangible. So. Yeah,
well, the big cheating scandal that is in the news right now is really, to me, this has been a long time coming. I mean, it's surprising it hasn't happened. Well, it may have been going on for a long time, much longer even than this current scandal. But it's a soft construct, to your point, right? So the very symptoms that we use to make a diagnosis of learning disability or to determine eligibility of learning disability are symptoms that all people have, kids have, but these are not unique and specific markers for some made in nature category that we really, really can know for sure does or does not exist. These are shades of gray, gradations of normal to abnormal. We set the cut score, the threshold somewhere, and it's driven by resources typically, just like you said. And it makes it a very vulnerable construct to misuse.
Mm.
We just have to ask ourselves, I think, because I look at some of Paul Morgan's data, and it makes my blood boil a little bit, I have to say. And I had a little bit of a Twitter war with him, and he was so gracious about it that I finally just had to make myself stop, because I think we just disagree. So there, his data, if you're not aware of his data, but he writes about once you control for everything, like starting achievement and the general achievement of the school that a child is in. And then he makes a case that children who are of minority ethnicity are actually underrepresented in special education. And this makes me come unglued, because the logical iteration of that is that we should be making children of minority ethnicities, we should be making them more eligible at higher rates for special education. And most of us came up understanding that the Office of Civil Rights was paying attention and saying that we actually have an overrepresentation problem. So how do you sort that out? Like, what does that really mean? And I guess here's what it comes down to for me. That's why I had to stop the Twitter war, because first of all, I like Paul, but second of all, because we just disagree. Respectfully, we disagree, because my position about that is until you can demonstrate that the process of making a child eligible results in services that provide demonstrable measurable benefit for that child that are superior to what they would have gotten if they did not get that label, then it's really hard to argue for a more liberal provision of that label, especially in the context of, we know there are side effects. We know that actually the data show that children who end up in those categories of disability in our system relative to similar kids who do not, the outcomes tend to be worse. They have a higher risk of dropout. They have higher risk of other adverse outcomes. So to me, you cannot advocate for more identification if you don't at the same time make sure, not just advocate for, but provide a real guarantee to a real parent sitting across the table that this will be a good thing for this particular student. We just can't do that at this time.
That, I think, is really the crucial piece that sort of put me on the RTI bandwagon. Part of that had to do with our measurement, and so when we can't control for the amount of error in our measurement, and when we have this hallmark of child struggles with learning, and there are 50 variables that could be contributing to that, then I can't pinpoint that it's specifically a learning disability every time. What happens when all the numbers are average and yet the child is still not achieving? There are other variables that we have to consider and other pieces of data that perhaps are not, non-cognitive factors that are influencing, or instructional pieces that are influencing.
Right. And it's hard work, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's hard work. And it means you really have to leave that office in the back of the building and actually go and work with a teacher who, by the way, is probably not happy to see you, say, hey, I want you to try something different, which nobody likes to hear, right? And it's hard work. It's not easy work, but it's more fulfilling work. I can remember probably 1997 or 1998, I sat in a meeting in South Louisiana, and there were 16 adults around this table talking about this little boy in first grade for 3 hours. And I remember at the end of this meeting, I was a graduate student. I had just finished my master's degree. And at the end of this meeting, the only thing that was useful that came out of the meeting was a decision about when to meet again. And of course, the teacher had cried and was this very sympathetic first grade teacher about how hard she was trying and how much she cared and how difficult it was. And you can sort of see it's like that doctor in that ER room saying all the contingencies align in favor of me doing the wrong thing for this child, except for one, which is that it's the wrong thing for this child. And so I left that meeting. And I remember I must have called Joe Witt, and I said, Joe, I don't know how I can do this. I think I've chosen the wrong career. And he said, well, tell me what happened. And I said, well, we just spent the equivalent of 48 hours of professional time talking about a little boy. And the outcome of that is just deciding to meet again. And this, I know exactly where this train is headed. And it's not the best outcome for this child. Could we not have used that 48 hours simply to teach this first grade child to read? That would have been better in the long run. And so, of course, Joe said, well, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to do that. But that's harder work. It is more socially meaningful, but it was not easy to go and work with that teacher. She didn't want to work with us. She didn't want to she thought that child, you know, another little concept I've thought about over the years is that teachers really get rewarded or reinforced in their minds that their teaching performance is effective when most kids learn. But there's a huge portion of kids in this world that really are just teacher proof. You can't screw them up. They can tolerate pretty messy instruction. They're going to do fine. That is not really sensitive feedback on the quality of your teaching effort. And yet, when you come in, there are definitely kids in that classroom for whom you've got to get it right. I mean, it's got to be surgical precision in terms of instructional quality to get that child to grow in the direction that they need to grow. And oftentimes, it's been tough for me to convince teachers that maybe that one or two children for whom it really, really matters, it's not that there's just something wrong with that child. It's really that these other 23, they were going to do fine anyway. This is your measure of your feedback because all children can grow, all children can learn.
That's so powerful. And the more that I've been learning personally on kind of just tier one effective strategies and talking, you know, we've spoken with Dr. Kilpatrick and Dr. Burns and learning kind of the science behind some of this. And I've seen some of the articles that have becoming more mainstream, like the Atlantic had one on, you know, the whole reading, you know, whole language. We're still using whole language approaches instead of phonics based, you know, for these type of kids. And it's really powerful, and it's really frustrating because we know that there's a lot of ineffective practices going on, but, you know, we're this one person in the school, and you know, maybe the school psychologist isn't involved in tier one or curriculum or anything like that. And to become involved and to say something and speak up about that is just really difficult. And there's a lot of pushback. So it's frustrating, but it's also, like you said, I think it's really rewarding when we do start to see some of that change.
Yeah, it really does. That's the organizational behavior management skills. That's the political know-how that we don't get a lot of training, but how can you, you start where you start. You know, and then from there, how do you gradually do the work to move that system in a more positive direction? You know, you're not going to overhaul tier one as a brand new school psychologist in the first year of your practice. You're not going to do that. But it's also a big mistake to say, I can't have any influence on tier one, and that's not my place, because you can't interpret your data if you don't. So you have to really begin to have a seat at that table and consider ways in which you can help move things in a more positive direction. And no kidding, I had a question from a teacher in the last few weeks who said, we are adopting a new math curriculum. I'm really, really worried about it because I don't think it's going to be good for my students. What should I do? And I said, well, you know, you should do what works. So a curriculum is just a tool. It's not something that you have to implement with fidelity exactly as prescribed. That's a big mistake to think about it that way. I mean, maybe you have to do that as a minimum, but you also have to do what works. So if it doesn't serve your kids, then you have to figure out, how are you going to supplement that? How are you going to find time to supplement that? And what's always been remarkable to me, as I said, I wanted to study tier 3 interventions. I thought we could really develop great tier 3 interventions that nobody had ever thought of that would really produce benefit for kids. But what happened was, when we screened, this was in Vail, Arizona in 2002, we found everybody had a class-wide learning problem. So we said, well, how do we figure out who needs tier 3? Well, okay, let's do standard. I made it up. Standard protocol, class-wide math intervention. We'll just make it up. We'll try it. So we did. We had a 98% successful response to intervention using a standard protocol class-wide intervention. This district went from middle of the pack in the state, rank order right in the middle for the state in math, to rank order position 1. Their LD rate went from 6% of their population to 3.5%. I mean, I was enormously frustrated because there were no children left for me to do this research with that I wanted to do. And so then I began to study more around class-wide math intervention. I'm still very interested in individual intervention. In my software that I've built, I've written 550 individual interventions for math, which were super fun to write. I just hope somebody will get to use them. If you use class-wide math intervention, I can talk about that with some knowledge because we studied it a lot. If you give that, and our data say from a randomized controlled trial, it's just sort of all comers and a base rate fail rate of about maybe 0.20. If you give that to 7 kids, you will save 1 from failing the high stakes test of math. It's pretty powerful. Mm-hmm. So in a class of 28 kids, if you run class-wide math intervention, which costs you 12 to 15 minutes per day, then at the end of the year, you will have saved 4 kids who would have otherwise failed the high stakes test of math. You will have prevented the failure of 4 kids. That's a big deal. So in the world of math, it's a really big deal because that math proficiency is very predictable. We know who you are very early if you're in trouble. And if you don't master whole number operations by grade 3 and fraction proficiency and proportion understanding by grade 6-ish and algebra 2 by grade 8, then you are likely to enroll in remedial math if you get into college. And if you enroll in remedial math when you get into college, you are unlikely to complete your college degree in any academic major. So in terms of like economic and social value, making kids proficient in math is something we should all care about. And that means we should be thinking, like you said, about Rachel, about, well, tier one is not working beautifully. How can I begin to shift that? And one of the things that I would just recommend to people who are new in the field, who are listening in, is think about class-wide intervention. It's a very powerful effect for a 12 to 15 minute effort. And the challenge of it, of course, is getting people to do it and stick with it in a high quality way for the duration of the school year.
And I like how you talked about, because I'm recalling too, and I know we have a question, so we're going to get to that. In your presentation, you had this really awesome graph that showed with assessments even that assessments cost us because they cost us time, and you want to look for the most bang for your buck essentially because time is so important. And that graph I felt was really powerful because it showed that you can get good results with a small amount of time if you're using effective measures versus we put these kids through these, hour-long tests sometimes to monitor progress, and maybe they're not as good as the 2-minute test.
Yeah, I laugh about that because here's the graph. This is the graph. We published this paper in School Psych Review, I think last year, maybe the year before. But we were trying to demonstrate or find, is there benefit? Can we demonstrate benefit as a result of all of this academic screening that we do? And alarmingly, we didn't find, but we actually found evidence of harm for higher performing students. And this was a reading screening study. But we did find some benefit, but only for the most at-risk students in the sample. But this graph is what you were asking about, and it's just the percentage of errors that are made by assessment type plotted against the number of minutes that it takes to conduct the assessment. And there are other ways you can quantify costs, not just minutes, but actual tangible dollars, right? So the MAP, for example, I've heard it can cost up to $15 per student per year. That's pretty high cost assessment in dollars. Curriculum-based measurement could be maybe $5 per student per year. So is less expensive in dollars. But then the other thing is time. If you just look at time, if you don't have any assessment, you'll miss 16% of kids in our particular sample who needed intervention. If you use CBM, you can get that down to 8%, so you only miss 8%. If you use DRA, which costs about 30 minutes of time, it's the same as CBM. And if you use MAP, you'll get it down to 6%. So you do get a 2% improvement in accuracy, right? For what that's worth. I mean, it's a good measure. It's a good screener. It should be. It costs you 40 minutes. And in fact, it should correlate more highly with outcomes like year-end state tests because it feels more like a year-end state test. It takes almost an hour of time.
That is a great slide. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to jump in with a viewer question. How would you recommend that we build bridges with teachers who come from different instructional philosophies than the research-based suggest would work?
Oh, that is a great question. That is a great question in my world because I love to work in math. You know, math is such an important area, under-researched, not as many tools. Again, not where I thought I would start out when I started my career, but I love, love, love working on math problems for systems. So in the math world, we run into this a lot because the math wars are still alive and well, and there are statements like, you know, fluency is bad for kids, or teaching an algorithm directly is bad for kids, or there's so many myths and misconceptions. Robin Cotting said we should do a session next year at NASP called Mythbusters, Math Mythbusters. And it's a great idea because, you know, there is so much that is misunderstood. And I think what happens with teachers is they care so deeply about children for the most part that the fear is contagious. So when they hear in a professional development session or maybe in their training program and they don't really understand it, so they maybe can't tell you why the algorithm is supposed to be so deadly to the math proficiency for these children, but they just learn it and they go, okay, don't do that, that's bad. And then they really end up feeling sort of like their hands are tied and all they can do is just exactly what is in their textbook. And so you can find these examples in social media where you'll see a teacher teaching the concept and it is supposed, you know, usually the social media posts are bashing Common Core, and it's supposed to be a lesson that is designed to establish conceptual understanding, but in fact it obfuscates it. It's just a crappy lesson that somebody has filmed and put on the web. But what happens, I think, is that teachers are really afraid. They don't want to harm children, and they've just gotten misinformation. So I think if you can start with, you know, don't make the mistake I did. In my early days, I would go to such teachers and I would just say, it's okay, you're just wrong. Let me just explain why you're wrong. And then we'll do the right thing. Turns out that's not always the best way, right? You have to do the work of building credibility, which is old-fashioned. There is no automatic credibility. You have to earn it fresh with every teacher, no matter who you are, no matter how many publications you have, no matter how much you have done in intervention. You got to earn it the old-fashioned way, and that comes from not just having a really good technical know-how of how to implement the intervention. Now, if you're afraid to do that intervention yourself with the class, you really can't ask the teacher to do it. So this requires school psychologists sometimes to stretch and gain some skills in terms of being able to work with large groups of children. I mean, some school psychologists have literally never done that. So they might be very threatened by that. Or they might think, well, I don't know anything about curriculum and instruction. Well, guess what? You better learn it. Because you need to be able to have the technical know-how to teach the teacher, these are exactly the active ingredients of this intervention. Here is what they look like. This is exactly what it will cost you in time and materials and resources. Here is a script on how to do it. And let me help you do it the first day. I'll be there with you. If you get stuck, we'll do it together. That's the only way interventions have a prayer of being able to work. But the other ingredient of that, besides the technical know-how, is that you have to have this these soft skills, sort of this, you know, like the Dean Fixon would call it adaptive leadership. The National Implementation Research Network would call this adaptive leadership, which is about being able to say to a teacher who's going to go on this intervention journey with you that, well, we may not know all the answers to this yet, but we will implement in this way, and then we will see what we see. And if it hasn't worked well, then we will make an adjustment and we will do the next thing. Well, guess what? That takes trust. That takes credibility. That takes the work of your work in saying, I'm going to show up, even if it went badly. Even if I know you are mad at me and you don't want to see me because I advised you to try this thing and it kind of blew up and a parent got mad or whatever, I'm going to show up. I'm going to face that music with you. And we will logically plan and take the next step, and we will track our progress and the results that we are getting in ways that we can all look at that and really feel good that we're getting a result. Not just anecdote, not just how did it go today, but really looking at gains in student learning and making thoughtful adjustments so that we can move the bar in the right direction.
I think that's really beneficial. You know, when you think about what we've done curriculum-wise, especially with reading through the 90s into, you know, the early 2000s. So we made a mess of it, and we forced practices on students and teachers that we now know were incorrect, inappropriate ways of teaching reading, and we made a mess out of it. And I think the results were a lot of kids who were tested and probably called learning disabled because we weren't teaching phonics, deliberately not teaching phonics. So, being there with teachers to say, yeah, I get that perhaps, especially a teacher who has experience and says, I think we're sort of being told to teach this way, but I'm not sure this is correct. As you mentioned already, being brave enough to do what's right for children and to support the teachers who are addressing that as well. I like that approach. And this is about those relationships, right? Those connections.
Yeah, I mean, it's educational malpractice to do otherwise. Mm-hmm. And there are plenty of tactics that are just based in nothing but dogma, nothing but philosophy-driven practices. I've said for years, I'll do anything that works. I don't care what it is. If we can demonstrate that standing on my head is going to improve learning, I'll do it. It's not a problem. It doesn't have to fit my theory. It doesn't have to be what I predicted would work 5 years ago. I'm willing to adapt my practice based on current evidence and do what works. I mean, can you imagine if you were the poor person who wrote the software code that caused these airplanes to go down? Can you imagine that? I mean, that's in effect what you just described is what happened in reading. Somebody had a philosophy-based approach and a lot of influence, and they were able to move policy in a direction that caused an entire generation of kids to graduate from school not able to read, who otherwise could have learned how to read. We're seeing the same things in the math world. And I say we all have to be about, it's not really self-righteous in my mind. It's about consequential validity, but it's also about more than that. It's making our profession sustainable. And if we don't do things and advocate for things that are evidence-based, then in fact, this is what I said in my tweet this week. I forget what had me fired up, but I think it was a conversation, honestly, about Jo Bowler. I don't like what she has to say about math. And I said, it is unconsented experimentation on children to do otherwise.
Yes, I saw that tweet. Yeah.
And what you're talking about, it is totally difficult and out of our comfort zone. I think a lot of psychologists to step out and feel like we know anything about teaching, which is a little bit crazy. But I can totally relate to that. And I've kind of used my kindergarten son as, practice with, I know that I felt like he was not getting the phonics instruction that he needs. And he's one of the ones that I feel like would do fine and would, is kind of teacher proof even. And he has a phenomenal teacher, but I'm just not, I felt like more phonics was needed. So I got just a little phonics book for $13 off of Amazon. And I was like, I'll try and do a couple lessons. And he immediately loved it because it made sense. And then instead of drilling the flashcards that they're sending home, it made more sense to him. And he immediately is like, I want to do a lesson. And he just really took off. And now, he's just doing phenomenal. But what I learned through doing that is that it's not that hard. We can do this, guys.
Yes.
That I used to homeschool parents that would homeschool, like, oh my gosh, how can you do that? That seems so hard. But after getting this little book, Dr. Engelman was the author, teacher.
Yeah. Teach your child to read in 100 lessons. Yeah.
And we went through the 100 lessons, and he reads, and it worked, and it was scripted, and it was easy, and he loved it, and it made sense, and I was just really pleased with it. But after that experience, I'm kind of like, what, I can do this. I could, if I were to pull a small group of students, I could follow a program or adapt things and teach phonics. We can do this, guys. I promise.
Yeah, we would all do well to kind of just turn down the fads and pay attention to what are the active ingredients of the things that are being promoted, and what does evidence say about that? I mean, by the way, it's going to be a fun journey for you when you send your kids off to school. That happened to me, and you go, oh gosh, I've bought lots of books for teachers over the years. You just give them as a gift, and with other, a candle or something. Try to hide it, but sneak in like a tough kid toolkit or something like that. But yeah, it's tough. I mean, my own children going to school has been a great experience for me. I've learned a lot just seeing, with being somebody who really appreciates teachers. all of my heroes have been teachers in my life, and I admire them. I want to be useful to them. And I think teachers are asked to do the impossible sometimes. And so just figuring out how to help them efficiently choose the things that can really work, like not moving a chair closer to her desk, because that's a waste of time. Not going to work. I hate to say it, but even with this cheating scandal, extended test time doesn't really work, right? We can do better than that. And the tactics are not, Engelman that work has been around forever. It's not a new idea.
Yeah.
I
wanted to ask you, we have a couple of viewer questions that I promise I'm going to get to also, but how do you think the science of teaching and teacher preparation has kept up with the research? And maybe in addition to that question, if we could think of ourselves, teachers do have so much on their plates every day. If we could think of ourselves as people who can say, get it, you've got all of these things that you're thinking about. I can think about this one intervention and I can help you with it, and we can do this together kind of approach, because I don't know, I feel like a teacher listening might say, something like, well, what do you mean I'm not using, this is what I learned. I know how to teach. This is my area.
Yeah, I would say it's not a mystery. It's knowable. Yeah. And it's amazing. It's always amazing to me, because I always ask the question when I'm working with the system, what's your proficiency rate? And oftentimes the teachers do not know the answer, probably most of the time. Yeah. And I always think, how can you teach third grade in a school where you don't know what your proficiency rates are off the top of your head? Because that is your feedback as a teacher. Right? I mean, I've worked in schools with 50% proficiency rates. And I think, well, in this school, 2 kids that I might pass in a hallway, one's going to learn to read and one is not. That's not acceptable. We can do better than that. We know we can do better than that. Children who really, truly have the worst, most severe learning disabilities can grow. Every child can beat their score from the day before. And if you pay attention to growth and you're tracking growth, well, then it's knowable. The efficacy of your teaching effort is knowable. It does not have to be mysterious to you. You just have to have the guts to look at it. And we can help teachers have the guts to look at it. And I say to teachers all the time, a low baseline is great news, because it's easier to get growth. So let's just pull the covers back. Let's just rip the Band-Aid off the wound and see how bad it is. Because then when we know, we can start making growth. And that is so fun. And it's rewarding for the teacher. I've worked with teachers who I thought, I don't understand how you continue to show up for school. I mean, it's just a miserable experience. And, you asked about the quality of the contemporary training programs for teachers. So I'll answer that. I mean, I'm not an expert and I do not have like a good grasp of those data, but I would say it's been my experience that teachers are often not prepared well to do the work that they need to do. And they can get derailed by something as simple as classroom management, because it's not easy to be a classroom teacher. And if you have one child who throws a chair, but you are a masterful reading teacher, but you've got a child who throws a chair just as you start teaching reading every single day, that's going to mess up your reading lesson. And so I think it's our job really as school psychologists to be allies to that teacher, to be instructional allies in the classroom, side by side, solving whatever barriers get. It's just truly is what Joe Witt originally hoped for. It's a functional analysis of the instructional environment, systematically remove the barriers, systematically install the accelerators, right?
That's great. Thank you for that. I know we're getting close to the end of our time, maybe a little bit over our time, but I want to just quickly share these 2 questions because they're good questions. One viewer asks, how does identification of SLD relate to the curriculum instruction curriculum instruction that they are receiving in Tier 1, especially when it doesn't align? Oh, no, sorry. I lost the question. So, how does it relate to the curriculum instruction they are receiving in Tier 1?
Yeah, well, so it's a great question, right? There has always been a requirement that we rule out inadequate instruction as part of the eligibility determination process. And so even though Criterion 2 says that you may use weaknesses, you may use discrepancy, you may use that approach to determine eligibility. You've always had criterion 4 that says you have to rule out inadequate instruction. If you use RTI to satisfy criterion 2, which you can also use it for criterion 4. If you use cognitive batteries of assessment to determine discrepancy for criterion 2, you still have to have RTI to rule out criterion 4. So either way, you have to become very proficient about assessing the instructional environment, knowing if it has been a good alignment with the needs of the student, and then installing an intervention test to test that if you deliver an intervention that is of high quality with fidelity, do you get growth? And you must be responsive to that, because when you see, and we just saw this for years on a very big scale, that we could pull kids out and we could do intervention and we could get very dramatic growth. And it wasn't like it was complicated intervention. It really wasn't. As I said, I wanted to study that. I never got to because we didn't need it. And if you see really strong growth, you have to be willing to say that the child is not benefiting from core instruction for a reason. And that is also knowable and not mysterious. It is something that we can take apart and look at. I've presented in places where maybe somebody came before me and gave a talk on RTI and said, you really can't do RTI until you've got 80% of kids being successful with the core curriculum. And I don't agree with that, because if you say that, you won't work in most schools. That just is not something that's very practical, because I especially want to help children who are in schools where 80% of kids are failing in the core. That is a very socially valuable effort to undertake. And you can chip away at that. You can install some layered intervention on top of core and use that to leverage and model and teach ways to improve core instruction.
That's great. Our last question is, what books or resources would you recommend that clearly outline effective research-based practices for reading and math, for example?
Ooh, Robert Keating has a new one for math. This is a good one. I like this one. And can you see it?
Yeah, Effective Math Interventions.
Yep, catchy little title. It's pretty good. I wish she'd asked me to write it with her. I love to write this stuff. We're revising our book that you showed. We're writing the second edition. By the way, that book got translated and sold in Korea.
That's fantastic.
People in Korea are thinking about how to use RTI to determine eligibility for SLD. It's fascinating to me. I'm very curious about that. But we're writing the second edition, and in the second edition, we will have a chapter on writing. We will have a chapter on reading, which Joe Kowaleski will do. Tim Rung will do the one on writing, and I will do the chapter on math. So we do know an awful lot about how to deliver effective intervention at tier 2 and tier 3, what the features of those interventions should contain. And I guess probably I've written about some of that in empirical articles, and probably like if you're using my software, you would have access to some of that in our support portal, because we try to give you for example, we provide 130 acquisition instruction lesson plans that teach 130 skills in math, from numeracy to algebra understanding, and include scripted activities to build conceptual understanding. As part of that work, we have audited our interventions, and we have certain features that we look for that we say are necessary to be considered an effective math intervention. And I'll go over time if I talk about that. But the same things exist in reading. There are of course more resources in the world of readings. They're not hard to find, but you want to look for peer-reviewed work as much as possible, right? And if your school is talking about, well, we're thinking about adopting this particular program, you don't want your evidence of efficacy to only come from what the publisher has shared with you. Right? The brochure, the website of the publisher. You want to dig a little deeper and see, well, what are the active ingredients? What's the logic model? Did they make it transparent and explicit? Have they evaluated it? And what are their published results?
That's great. Your current website is springmath.com?
It is, yeah.
Okay. just so people can find you.
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And I know that you're going to be speaking in a little bit at the Maryland School Psych Association conference all day long, right? So
Yes.
anybody who's interested, I think if you're in the area, check that out.
Yeah, there's actually a good conference that I was really excited to get invited to, because I've coveted this invitation for years and never gotten it until this year. But it's Mark Shin's conference that they put on, and I forget, they have a catchy little name for their group. I forget what they call themselves, but it's Mark Shin and Alan Coulter, and it used to be Bob Pasternak, but he is retired, and Kim Gibbons. Oh my goodness, she's a fabulous presenter and just fabulous thinker. She's got a couple of great books there on my shelf, Kim Gibbons. And then they have other people that they sort of invite to come. And I'm going to talk about math. That's in New Orleans the day before the Maryland conference. So and that conference is one that anybody can go to. It's a national conference.
Yeah. That's great. I know that some of our listeners and readers are on the School Psych forums, and Mark Shin is very visible and provides a lot of really good information. So definitely worth checking him out as well. And
it always makes me laugh. I'm so grateful that he answers those questions, right? I mean, you realize he could be writing a manuscript instead.
Right.
He puts all of that brilliant thinking right into an email response on the listserv, and every single time I'm like, thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
What you said makes so much sense, and people needed to hear it. I really think he makes a difference.
Yeah, I think so too. And sometimes there include bibliographies. Like he will list his research and his articles that he's gotten that information from quickly. It's pretty impressive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Such a great topic, and such thank you so much for taking the time and coming and chatting with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay. We had asked the last questions, and I think we got everything.
Evidence-based.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
Okay.
Yes. So I know that a couple of us were chatting over at NASP and whatnot, and how do we disseminate evidence-based practices and whatnot, given the gap of research to practice type of thing. And I know that Rebecca, you explain this because you're better with words than I am.
Well,
what's going on?
We thought that it would be helpful to have a place for those of us who are really interested in making sure that our practice is evidence-based and making sure that we are wisely using our time in the best interest of our students to talk and share resources and questions. And so there is a brand new Facebook group, and it's called Evidence-Based School Psychology. Am I right, Rachel?
I think so. We'll share it out once we.
Yes, Evidence-Based School Psychology. So if you look it up, I think you will be asked if you'd like to join, and then hopefully, I'm not sure yet, but we were thinking about it would be nice to know why you would like to join. So if you could just tell us a little bit, I think that would be great for a place for us to all continue to talk and share ideas.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. See, you're so much better than I am. So sorry to put you on the spot. But I think, it's a work in progress. But we were excited when we heard that was, going to be maybe a new resource out there. So
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda.
Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.